welcome aboard.
Hi gentle people, I'm Val from 18 Squad Lab. Today I'm glad to release this new 1/32 diorama, Hell in Paradise. Prior to start this tutorial, don't forget that you have the power to help me grow this channel by leaving a comment or a thumb up. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing and hit the bell to stay notified whenever a new video is released. That will for sure greatly encourage me to continue sharing scale modeling tips and tricks and techniques with you. Okay, without waiting, first chapter. I decided to sculpt myself these 4 bad boys with polymer clay. For this, I use super sculpty firm. I choose the tiger sharks because they are predators hunting in shallow waters, really present in South Pacific, and I really love their skin camouflage. That was my first ever attempt to sculpt something else than sandbags with polymer clay. So my approach of the challenge might not be a school example. The first tricky point I encountered was to respect the proportion, as these sharks are real living beings, belonging to a given shark species. I started to create a skeleton with steel wire. To work more comfortably with polymer clay, and then to be able to put my creation in the oven without damaging the fragile fins, it was necessary to create a little wood support. This support was then drilled to receive the metallic spine of the shark. I then twisted other little segments of metal wire around the spine to reproduce the main dorsal fin and the main pectoral fins. I then welded roughly these little wires to give more rigidity to the structure. It will be really helpful later when sculpting to position these fins at the right distance from the nose. I still had a little bit of Fimo-Soft polymer clay in stock that I didn't use because it's a little bit too flexible to my point of view. I used it to make a hard junction between the wood support and the steel skeleton. The Fimo polymer clay, once cooked, was rock hard, and so it was much easier to apply and sculpt the super sculpty firm on top of it. Then the rest is just, sculpting with your fingers and silicone tools to try to give this shark a decent shape. The biggest advantage of polymer clay is that it doesn't dry in contact with the air. So basically, that means that you have plenty of time to work the material until you reach the desired appearance. Having a rigid and strong skeleton below your polymer clay will really help you to sculpt the shape of the shark, especially at this scale and for the tail section, for example, which is really thin and likely to bend in all directions when you apply pressure on it. It's quite annoying. It's also very important to work with reference pictures to help you to reach the right appearance. Well, there is still work ahead. The different fins were also created with polymer clay and sculpted with this material prior to cook the shark. As you might have seen on these images, I cut the steel wires that were used for positioning the dorsal and pectoral fins. It's just because I found it much easier to apply the fins and to work the fins without having this steel wire passing through. The head of the shark was also sculpted using reference pictures, especially for the biggest shark that has its mouth open. For sure, it requires a little bit of practice. I made many trials and mistakes, but with patience, you will need it, everything is working. You have no time pressure, so just take your time and continue the work until you reach the final desired appearance. Well, for me, it was not an option to create shark without seeing their teeth, and given my skills at sculpting, it was also not an option to sculpt these teeth one by one. So I had to find another option for this problem. The solution I found was to use a little brass sheet that I cut with scissors, and I put this brass sheet into the mouth prior cooking the shark. Let's not forget their gills, there are 5 on each side. We will then wash them with a little bit of isopropylic alcohol just to reduce all the fingerprints that could remain and remove the polymer clay wastes. After 45 minutes in the oven at 130 degrees Celsius, our sharks are rock hard. We can remove them from their wood support and use a little bit of Tamiya Epoxy putty quick type to fill in the gap. Prior to paint the sharks, I also decided to sand a little bit the different fins just to reach the required shape, but also to make them thinner. Just like any other models, the shark have been washed with soapy water and then primed. It's very important to be able to detect any potential imperfections. Well, most of the painting has been done with the airbrush with my needle 0.4 mm. The underside of the body was painted insignia white, after which I applied 3 layers of scratch effect product from Megamo before applying my base coat. This base coat is a little bit darker than the vertical flanks of the sharks. These flanks will be painted with pure sky grey. The last grey reference that we will use is German grey. That's the color reference that I will use to paint the different spots of the camouflage, but also the leading edge of the different fins. But prior to paint these darker areas, we will first reactivate our scratch effect product with water to reproduce this separation between grey and white. The dark spots of the camouflage were then painted with the airbrush with a thinner needle. No need obviously to count the number of spots on the body, but watch out anyway to try to respect the proportion of the different spots and lines in order to avoid to end up with a kind of ladybug appearance. This camouflage is really beautiful. That's also a very nice challenge to paint with your airbrush. We will finish this airbrush work by applying a layer of highly diluted sky grey and another layer of highly diluted base coat above this camouflage scheme, just to better integrate it and to fade a little bit more the different spots. We will then complete the painting work with a paintbrush and a sponge to create small scars left and right, using reference pictures to help our work. Okay, next chapter.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
I used the exact same process for my life raft than the one I use for the sharks. That means, first, try to find the different dimensions. I found these dimensions for a 3-man life raft on the web. I'll leave you 2 website references in the description below. Based on these dimensions, I created a metallic skeleton. I used to help me a printed pictures at scale, and I already deformed this metallic structure to give the final appearance to the raft. This structure was reinforced with Fimo soft polymer clay and then cooked in the oven 30 minutes at 130 degrees Celsius. Once back cold and rock hard, I then applied my super Sculpey on top of the skeleton and I sculpted all the rest of the main bladder. The bottom of the raft was also done using polymer clay. As you can see on these images, I'm using a silicone baking mat to work my polymer clay, as this type of clay doesn't stick to silicone items. It's really easy to give texture to polymer clay using other items. Here I use the aluminum foil just to create the folded texture of the bottom. Polymer clay can be made really thin, which makes it an interesting material to create tarps or other small pieces of equipment, and it's also much cheaper than other 2 components epoxy putty. Moreover, you don't have any time pressure, as it doesn't dry so long it's not cooked. I wouldn't say that it's super easy to sculpt, even with polymer clay, but this product makes the process of creating small objects much easier, and I was super happy with the results I managed to reach for a first sculpting experience. As I said, you can even sculpt small items, just like these two little pouches in the front part of the raft and this survival bag. Just like for the 4 sharks, I washed my life raft with isopropylic alcohol and then I baked it 45 minutes at 130 degrees Celsius. Once hard, it was time to finalize all the different little details, either with epoxy putty to components quick type from Tamiya, or with styrenes or plastic elements. This includes the mooring rings, the rope supports. That part was a little bit more challenging due to the size of the rope at that scale, and the CO2 inflation cartridge that was realized with evergreen strips and other unused small plastic pieces coming from older kits. Given the coming yellow-orange color, I primed my life raft with Mr. Mahogany Surfacer 1000. If you want to achieve a nice yellow that pops nicely, I highly advise you to use a white layer underneath. We won't obviously cover the brown layer completely, so that we can already create a kind of pre-shading. I then applied my base coat, trying not to cover completely the raft and trying to preserve this pre-shading. Then I applied the highlights on all sections more exposed to the sunlight. As you can see, the darker areas are still visible in the different corners. Finally, I decided to add a kind of weathering coat on top of that, just to give a little bit more realism to the color and to increase the weathered aspect of the life raft. But it was necessary to remain soft, as these life rafts were quite new. I was so excited by this little raft that I then thought, yeah, to increase realism, I will also add the bladder segment. You know how it works, always something more. For that, I used Tamiya tape that I cut at the right width, and what was perfect with that is that the Tamiya tape already has the right color. Now, for an additional precaution, I decided to add a little bit of cyanoacrylate glue below the tape to prevent it from coming off in the future. To enrich a little bit more this monochromatic yellow appearance, I decided to use all paints. So basically I use references like titanium white, ochre yellow, raw umber, individually or mixed together with different ratios, and I blended all these colors with another paintbrush, slightly wet with white spirit. Once dried, I installed my tiny rope, and for that it was necessary to enlarge a little bit more all the different supports and the CO2 inflation cartridge on the front side of the raft. I then use a little bit of UV resin to reproduce the presence of water inside of the raft due to the boarding of the crew member. This UV resin has a high viscosity, it's very interesting to reproduce water and much more effective than just applying a kind of gloss varnish. It also dries immediately, which is really interesting to spare time. I also speckled this UV resin to reproduce all the water projection due to the shark attack on the raft, which also helps to reinforce the global wet appearance of the life raft. Without waiting, Chapter 3. I will be short on that chapter. I won't explain all the different corals I built. All my corals have been done with polymer clay, with the exception of one species that I did with some little branches. To realize these corals with polymer clay, there are 3 points to consider. The first one being the shape, the second one the texture, and the third one the colors. And above all that, you have to organize the cooking periods, as sometimes it's necessary to cook the different elements prior to glue them together. To glue them together, I just use cyanoacrylate glue. To shape the different corals, you can use your fingers, you can also use silicone brushes or different objects. Using silicone baking mat also helps a lot to work the polymer clay without having adhesion problems. Regarding the creation of texture, you can use different objects. It could be a hard paintbrush, or like here, avocado. Any object that already has a texture might be used to print this texture on the polymer clay. Another very interesting method to create texture is to use a kind of polymer modeling paste that you apply with a paintbrush. A very important point to help you is to work with reference pictures. All the pictures here are pictures that I used to create my corals. Coral reef is really different from anything we know above the surface, unless you scuba dive frequently, but that's not my case. The selection of the corals to reproduce is mainly a matter of capability to reproduce them, because some of them are so complex that I personally didn't manage to find a procedure to sculpt them with the polymer clay or any other type of material. That coral species is the only one I reproduced without using polymer clay. Given its tree appearance, I thought it was much easier to work with branches. So I had a walk in the mountain range nearby where I picked up some little branches. Then it was a little bit like a bonsai trimming, you know. I just cut all the different branches close to their intersection. I then glued all these tiny elements together using cyanoacrylate gel. I also recommend using cyanoglue activator. It will greatly ease the gluing process. Finally, I applied my texture paste with a paintbrush on all the different little branches to realize the texture. We already developed the shape and the texture. The last point to consider was the color. I won't develop all the different colors I used for each coral. It would be much too long to develop. If you have any question on this subject, you can contact me directly by private message or by leaving a comment here below. To summarize and simplify things, let's say that I started to give the first layer with the paintbrush. Then I used different painting techniques, application of different washes, paintbrush for small works, sponge technique to paint the different rocks using consecutively different colors, while other easier items like these anemones were only painted using the airbrush. Once again, the key here is to work with reference pictures. Let's see now how I built this base. I used leftover styrofoam having a thickness of 4 cm that I then glue on a polycarbonate sheet with a hot glue gun. To reproduce the rocky terrain on the bottom of the ocean on which our corals take place, I immediately thought about using pine bark. That's the kind of thing you can easily find in garden centers. Now, the problem with wood elements that you submerge in epoxy resin is that they are really prone to create air bubbles. Oh yeah. So it was necessary to seal these elements prior to use them, and I decided to seal them with a coat of epoxy resin with low viscosity so that it was possible to enter all the different cracks and holes. I wanted these rocks to pop out from the sandy bottom, and given these bark have a curved base, it was necessary to dig a hole to put them in position. I then used plaster to glue all these elements on the base and to fill in the gaps between the bottom side of the bark and the upper side of the styrofoam. This plaster mixture was also used to cover the rest of the styrofoam to create the main relief of the terrain. I then painted all the different rocks using the exact same paint reference and paint techniques that I used for the other isolated smaller rocks. Once completely painted, it was time to add sand. Actually, this is real construction sand, and I sifted it with a sieve, a bit like flour. I started first with the crevices, where I glued this sand with a mixture of PVA glue and water. For the remaining parts of the diorama, I applied first the PVA glue with a paintbrush prior to applying my sand. Once the base was completely covered and the glue still wet, I started to apply all the different little elements, that is, the dead corals, the different smaller rocks. All these elements have been glued with PVA glue. I also added at that moment some little stones prior to start painting the sandy area. I really wanted my sand to look like, you know, those heavenly white sand beaches. After this little painting session, it was then time to apply the last coral elements on the different rocks. If you are interested to learn how to build an epoxy resin form, go and check my previous video, the link is here above. This epoxy resin depot procedure has started with a very thin layer of epoxy resin. That's what you are seeing here. That first thin layer will seal our sandy area to prevent the apparition of many air bubbles. That first layer is thin and is not colored. It's a low viscosity resin that has a 24-hour curing time. I applied it on all the sandy areas, but also at the junction with the different rocks and with the polycarbonate sheets. It was now time to position my injured turkey in the aquarium, and with its moving broken wing, it wasn't an easy task. The depot procedure was divided into 5 steps, that is 5 layers of 4 kilos, each layer giving more or less a layer thickness about 3 to 4 centimeter height. To get the exact same color per layer, I weighed the resin with a precision of 1 to 5 grams, and I colored it with the exact same numbers of drops of resin ink. The epoxy resin I used is coming from Artline. I used the Wood Pro reference for the depot and the Crystal reference for sealing the bottom of the aquarium. I really like their product. It's a top-notch resin and you can have a 10% discount on their website using my code LAB. Each layer needs about 2 days of curing time prior to pour the next layer. So in total, it was about 10 days of process to pour the 5 layers. Prior to pour each layer, my resin has been vacuumed thanks to a vacuum pump. I won't enter all the details in this tutorial regarding the epoxy resin process, given I plan to publish another video within a week or 2, specifically for the complete epoxy resin process, as unfortunately, not everything ran according to plan. I met some issues, some more serious than others, and I think it's very important to share with you a bit deeper into detail all these lessons learned that I gained from this process. This all epoxy resin procedure was almost a disaster, so I'm rather glad that I made it till the end. I also intended to reproduce engine oil leaks within the water. For this purpose, I used pigment paste specifically designed for epoxy resin. As you can see, to make it a little bit more fluid, I mixed the paste with epoxy resin first, and then I gently pushed this pigment paste within the engine bay, and I started to move the brass rod into the resin to create these kinds of, let's say, engine oil streaks. I applied the exact same technique for the blood streaks into the water around the pilot compartment. You know, it was necessary to create a link with the shark presence. I also put in position the fork sharks and the life raft in the resin at different depths. Given I used 5 different layers, it was pretty easy to position these elements on the previous cured layer. So it wasn't necessary to use, any kind of transparent support. The trickiest part was, without any doubt, to position the life raft correctly at the right level and with the right attitude. For this, I had to create another specific support with fragment of polycarbonate sheets, and given the Maxilla wasn't of any use anymore at that time, it was possible to remove it to facilitate the work. You really have to make sure that nothing will move during the curing time of the epoxy resin for at least 12 to 15 hours, so it's very important to take time to make this support correctly. As for each layer, protect your project during the curing time. Well, that's it. Time to unmold and finish the work. We will start with the lateral sides of this big resin block, removing the resin lip using a sharp hobby knife prior to sand the whole resin block from 80 grit till 5000 grit. As you can notice, the top surface of the diorama has been protected with a paper cover. I used a dry sanding method until 600 grit and wet sanding method above 600 grit. I will come back in detail on the sanding procedure in my next video fully dedicated to the resin work, as it's quite specific, and here again there are many lessons learned to share with you. After the sanding process, I polished the resin with a polished paste. At the end of this last process, our resin will be completely transparent, just like glass. There are other methods to recover the resin transparency without having to sand so much and without polishing, like using a varnish on top of the sanded sides or applying another very thin coat of epoxy resin with a paintbrush. But most of these procedures will create visual distortions, that is, shape deformation of what's on the other side of the applied product. And that's really less nice to my point of view. The very last step to conclude this diorama is to realize the wave's ripples and the water foam around the different objects. The wave ripples have been created in 4 steps. Step 1. Create the relief of the waves with UV resin. During these steps, we just focused on the main wave's orientation and wave height. Step 2. We create the very small ripples on top of the waves using a round paintbrush and this AK Interactive product. You can't use this product to create the main relief of the waves, as if you apply too much of this product at once, I mean a too thick layer, it won't cure correctly, and after curing you will end up with some foggy areas within the waves. I advise you not to apply more than 2 mm thickness of this product at the time. After the curing period of step 2, I started to apply the different water splashes around the shark's head. To do that, I used cotton wool, on which I applied a little bit of UV resin with a paintbrush. Initially, it's a little bit tricky, but you quickly learn how to do this process. UV resin is super fast to dry with the UV torchlight, and it remains completely transparent, so it gives a very nice appearance for this effect. As you can see, I also used UV resin to put these water splashes around the shark and to glue them in position. Time to go back to step 3 of our wave creation. Unfortunately, I forgot to record that part, shame on me, but it's a short one. Step 3 basically is just the same as step 1. What I did is I used UV resin to create a more complex relief of the waves. Basically, I built secondary waves with the UV resin extended across the main longitudinal waves that I created in step 1. Step 4 and last step for the wave creation is basically the same as step 2. I reapply another full layer of the AK Interactive Water Gel Transparent on top of my UV resin. So basically you have 2 layers of UV resin and 2 layers of water gel transparent. To my opinion, that was necessary to create a more complex visual appearance for our waves. This diorama is almost done, but it still lacks a little bit of dynamism. So we still need to apply a little bit of water foam around the moving objects, that is the shark, the life raft and our injured turkey. To apply the foam, again, two different steps. The first one is using this water gel effect from AK Interactive with a little bit of acrylic paint white inside of it and a few drops of water. This mixture is applied with a paintbrush all around the edges of these moving objects and then spread with a sponge. Obviously, we won't stay limited to the edge of the object. You can extend a little bit more outwards just to give this impression of air bubbles created by the different turbulences in the water. To finish this work, we will apply a second coat of a mixture of water gel effect mixed in equal quantities with snow sprinkles and a little bit of white again. Why do we add snow sprinkles in this mixture? Well, to my opinion, snow sprinkles gives more volume to the mixture. It seems, and that's what we are looking for, that there are many air bubbles coming in the mixture. We will apply this mixture only with the paintbrush, a flat head paintbrush, and we will focus only on the edges of the moving objects. So we will not extend too far out of those objects. I think it's nice to simulate really the apparition of water foam. We might consider our work completed at this stage, but this product unfortunately has a drawback. It gives a matte finish where it is applied. It's obviously not an option for a water diorama. Water gel transparent and UV resin also have a drawback. They are a little bit sticky once dried. There is luckily a way to counteract all these drawbacks in only one action: apply a very thin coat of epoxy resin on top. So, I mixed about 40 milliliters of epoxy resin crystal reference and I applied it on top of all my diorama. It was also the perfect occasion to completely wet our aircraft that smashed into the water a little bit earlier. To realize this effect, I used a wider fan brush and I dipped it in epoxy resin prior to brush the whole model. During this work, no single part of the aircraft is spared, not even the transparent pieces, as landing an aircraft at more than 100 km an hour into the water will not spare any part of the aircraft, as can be seen on this reef break real footage of a TBM Avenger ditching at sea. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed the content. If you enjoyed, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell and comment to help me grow this channel and continue to share with you nice scale modeling tips and tricks. Don't forget, as I said earlier, that there will be an upcoming video shortly to deal with the epoxy resin depot procedure a little bit more in details. A video in which I will share with you the dark side of the work with epoxy resin and all the stupid mistakes that I did on that project and their sad consequences. Thanks for watching, greetings from Portugal, ciao ciao.